Welcome back to another episode of Mailbag here on Sound 101. You guys liked Lauren Popish so much on the last episode, we've brought her back to do Mailbag to take your questions and get them answered. So without any further ado, let's get started.
This question comes from Best AJ Ever. What is something that is often overlooked in the process of a podcast? It's really easy for all of us to want to start a podcast. We're either sharing a glass of wine with a friend or talking to a coworker, and we turn to each other and say, let's start a podcast. But the reality is that podcasting is actually kind of difficult. It takes a lot of time. There's a big learning curve, and sometimes it can be expensive. So when you get to the process of actually starting your show, you might start to wonder, why am I doing this again? I think one of the biggest steps that is overlooked is crafting a why, a purpose behind your show. Because at some point you're gonna wake up one day and say, I don't really feel like working on my podcast, or I don't wanna stay up late editing my show. Without that why or mission statement or whatever you wanna call it, you're going to run out of steam and it's going to be hard to be successful, because if you don't have a why, it's probably not worth your time. I'd like to start selling podcasting services for clients. What rates should I charge? How do I value myself? What I did to get started with my pricing is I went out and conducted a market analysis. So I went and looked at all of the podcasting services out there and tried to see what the range is, what's reasonable for podcast services. My second tip would be to try and differentiate yourself in the market. There's a lot of podcast services out there, but you want to tell your audience or your clients how you do what you do a little bit differently. And then lastly, I would look at your experience level, how you do your editing, what's included in your production services to really round out pricing that makes sense for your audience and makes sense on what you're actually giving them in the end. This one comes from Chase W. Stein. What's your recommendation for doing a podcast setup outdoors? My recommendation is to not do podcast setups outdoors, but if you absolutely have to, your equipment becomes even more essential. You might want to try and find an environment where you're a little bit protected. Maybe you're in a band shell, or you're in an outdoor cabana, or some kind of space that at least protects you a little bit from the elements. And just make sure that you have the right equipment, something close to your mouth, something that's going to pick up a limited field and not get all that background noise. And ideally, maybe think about recording indoors. That's the best I can do. This next question is from Burning Down the Kraus. If I'm making a new podcast, should I find someone to do it with me, like a co-host, or should I do it myself? Also, does it need to be on video for it to be successful? You'll find successful shows with co-hosts or with solo hosts. You'll also find successful podcasts that are audio only or that have video as a part of it. So what's more important is to ask, what kind of show do you want to produce? What does your audience that you're trying to reach expect from you in your show? You can definitely produce a great show by yourself, so don't worry about having to find someone to do it with you unless it makes sense, adds value, and brings something special to your audience. It's not an easy task to produce a video podcast, so if you want to get started more quickly, I'd consider starting with audio and then adding video later on. It's possible that your audience loves your audio-only podcast just as it is, and you never have to move to video. This question comes from Best AJ Ever. What do you look for in a podcast hosting service? There are dozens of podcast hosting services, and the truth is they largely do about the same things. A lot of folks like free platforms, but keep in mind that nothing is truly free. When you purchase a free hosting platform, you often give up a lot of stuff in exchange for that, like your data or lesser features or analytics. Maybe that's not the best fit. For me, I use Captivate because I love the fact that they offer dynamic ad insertion as a part of their base package. That's something that's often a premium feature for most hosting services, but Captivate gives it away to everyone, and I really appreciate that. What is the best way to grow your podcast? One of my favorite ways to grow your show is by not just bringing guests onto your podcast, but by you going out and being a guest on other shows. You don't have to go to social media and convince people to love podcasts or download an app, you're already in the ears of people who listen to podcasts. And this is your opportunity to give them some value on someone else's show and convince them that they should pick up their phone right there, and hopefully they'll go over to your show and hit the subscribe button. I hope that answered your questions. And if you want to learn more about podcasting, you can subscribe to my podcast, Podcast Like a Girl. Thanks again. Bye for now.